Hey, and welcome back to How to Start, Grow and Monetize Your Podcast. Me, James Burt, and him, the podpreneur, Alex Chisnell. Welcome back to the podcast. If you've been here before, thank you very much for tuning back in. If you're brand new here, welcome along. We are powered by the wonderful Pod School. That's mine and Alex's little community that we're building of great podcasters.
Nothing little about it, mate.
Well, no, it's the massive community of podcasters over on the school platform. We have webinars, we have training sessions, we have got training videos, we've got downloads, guides, an amazing community of people who are all taking their content and their podcast to the next level. So, in today's episode, we are going to be talking about what actually makes a podcast successful. Now, this is a bit of like a how long is a piece of string kind of vibe, because success, much like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. What do you think makes a successful podcast, Mr. Chisnell?
I think this is the first question that you need to ask yourself.
100%.
So, as you've rightly said, this is going to be different for every single one of you listening and watching to this podcast. So have a good think about, what does podcast success actually look like for you? Actually build that out. You know, what is that for you?
Put it on paper.
Write it down.
Sure.
Is it a number? Are you somebody who is motivated by numbers? You want to hit a specific number of downloads. You want to hit a specific number of subscribers or followers. You want to hit a particular number in the chart for a specific country. I mean, that's, as I've alluded to before, when I took my podcast, Screw It, Just Do It seriously in 2019, I set myself a goal and it was numerically listed, i.e. I wanted to get to number one in the UK with my podcast, okay? It could have been different. I could have said I want to get to 1 million downloads. It could have been I want to get to a million followers or subscribers. But for whatever reason at the time, that's what I chose. For somebody else, and look, for me, this was the reason I started my podcast. It was simply to get into a room and speak to people that I wouldn't normally get in a room with. That was what success looked like for me. And has that been successful? 1,000x that's been successful.
Absolutely.
You know,
I think you're so right with that first question being and that's literally when I get onto a call with a potential client, that's the first question I ask. What does podcast success look like for you? That's literally the question I ask them.
Yeah.
Because it's very telling, and a lot of people.
In my top 3.
Is it? Yeah. But you need to understand that, because again, you might be going, well, of course, you just want the biggest numbers, you want the biggest downloads, you want to be the next Joe Rogan, you want $1 million worth of advertising revenue. But that's not the case for every single person. We've ended up doing a lot of. We do a lot of B2B podcasts. We work with actors, athletes, celebrities, influencers, all that kind of good stuff. But we also work with loads of experts, consultants, mentors, coaches people who make their money in the expert economy, and also brands that want to have a different way to engage with a B2B market. And for a lot of podcasts that we launch, the podcast is almost the Trojan horse for getting their foot in the door. So we've done a lot of stuff with recruitment recently. So now when they come to us, they don't want... they like to be number one in the subsector of business, which is careers. Yeah, that might be a nice to have, but their number one prerogative or their number one primitive goal is to get their foot in the door with people they've never been able to get in contact with. So to give you an idea, we had a podcast that came to us, and the guy was a part-time temporary geological recruiter for the deep piling industry. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. I knew those words, but not in that sequence. And he was like, should I do a podcast? I went, in all honesty, mate, I don't know. What does podcast success look like for you? And he said, look, as a recruiter in this super, super, super niche, there's only 25 companies that I could really ever work with in the country. I just need a way to get a foot in the door. I said, well, what's the challenge with it at the moment? He said, well, recruitment's very linear. You phone up and go, hey, have you got a people requirement at the moment? Yes or no? If yes, great. Can we pitch for the work? If no, okay, cool. I'll call you back in 6 months. There's no brand that's been built there. There's no relationship that's been built there. There's no affinity that's been built there. There's no additional getting your foot in the door. You've got someone's phone number. You might have got the HR officer's details, but that doesn't mean you're going to get to the end result that you want, which is ultimately cash in the bank in this instance. When he went back and said, hey, I've got a podcast called the Grand Investigation Podcast, and we talk about the piling industry for geological experts, would you like to come onto the podcast? Then all of a sudden it opened the doors. Now, of those 25 countries, of those 25 companies that he could ever work with, I think he's ended up having like 23 of them on the podcast.
Wow.
Within the first couple of years. So again, podcast success for him was opening the door. We worked with another recruiter and they had re-engaged with an old client who hadn't used them for years and years and years, and they ended up landing a consultancy role that paid him £80,000.
Yeah.
So again, for them, they're not looking to try and be the next Bartlett, the next High Performance, the next Happy Place, the next Joe Rogan, the next Lewis Howes. They're looking to utilize their podcast as a Trojan horse to open the door. So it's really important that you understand what podcast success actually is for you.
Yeah, and we, just to kind of pile onto that, from a conversation I've recently had with a client of ours, and they were asking, okay, what can we do to improve the download numbers? And I'm like, okay, let's have a look at download numbers and look at the consistency of your podcast, and massive gaps in when they were putting out the podcast.
That's problem number one.
Exactly that. Exactly number that. But they were ultimately questioning the growth of the podcast. Okay, and that's what I referred back to, is look at how, I was going to say consistent you were. Look how inconsistent you've been. But actually, let's just revisit what you said podcast success look like for you. And I said, reframe that for me. What does podcast success look like for you? This company was in the financial services space. So that part of the financial services space whereby you are making an online transaction, and behind that online transaction there is a load of technology as to working out, is the person who's putting in the payment for that transaction, who are they, what country are they in, can that be trusted, is it a yes, is the payment going to go through payment gateways, stuff like that.
Right.
Okay. And where I'm going with this is that when we actually revisited that, for them, podcast success wasn't about the numbers. Podcast success was getting in the room with the decision makers in their industry, because they were a small player and they wanted to be having conversations with the bigger players, because that would lead to growth and then scale of what their technology was. And as if by magic, I referred them to a LinkedIn post that they put out saying that they had just landed a deal that was the equivalent of them signing Amazon in their industry, the equivalent of them signing up Amazon in their industry, a whole LinkedIn post, and how big a financial deal they just struck, and how they did that deal because they invited that person onto their podcast. The relationship was made in the podcast studio, was followed up with a coffee, lunch, a meeting, etc., and the deal was done. So it all comes back to that, which you rightly said. What does podcast success look like for you? It doesn't necessarily mean millions of downloads, millions of followers or subscribers. It could just mean having meaningful conversations with somebody. It could be, I'm thinking of a meditation app that I know, who has this, message they want to get out into, because they want to help any number of people, reach a certain goal, bring calmness and inner peace to that person. Whether it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid, I would say. And my example, my own podcast is probably a good example of that. Don't be afraid to dream really big and have massive aspirational goals, because you might try, without trying to get woo-woo on you here, you might want to try and get to the moon, but you might not get to the moon. But I'm going to get really woo-woo. But you might reach the stars, James, instead.
Wow.
You might not reach the moon, but you reach the stars on the way to the moon.
Joe, editor, please put like a rocket underneath him or something. Or put like a...
You're trying to blow me up. It's just been bonfire night.
A starry scene behind him. Yeah, but
you know what I'm saying, though.
100%. One of the things that it said on here, like as in
that
bullet points to talk about. No, but I do get it, and I completely agree with it. Measuring success goes beyond downloads.
Yes.
What about engagement? What about feedback? What about the people that it's made a difference to? I will never forget the first time I sat in an airport having a coffee.
Fanboy moment.
And someone came up behind me. They went, "I'm so sorry, you're not James Burt from that podcast, are you?" I was like, "Oh my god!" And my mates I was with, like, your fucking face went so red. How big is your head right now? But they were like, "I listen to it every week. It's changed my thinking about everything." I'm like, how cool is that to have that positive effect on one person? That could be success. But equally, again, when a lot of the time people look at, well, how can we take this podcast to the next level? The next level, firstly, another level, another devil. But oftentimes people are like, oh, the next level is me getting more downloads. But what about if you could engage that audience? But what about those sometimes listeners who tune in for like 1 in 4 podcasts if they happen to like the name of a guest? What about if you double down? You're like, how do I create more engagement with them? How do I crowdsource information from them? How do I encourage them to help me to grow my social media? How about I ask what kind of subjects that they want to create? How about I look at other ways that I can monetize? How about I could do like you've done and we talked about on previous episodes before, like imagine a live interview that you do and you do it as a ticketed event. How about it becomes a retreat? How about it becomes a book? How about it becomes a blog? How about it becomes any number of things? Again, if you look at strictly on the download numbers or the revenue, those are only 2 metrics that you might have. And by the way, those are a consequence of making great, consistent content.
Correct.
You look again. We talked about Tim Ferriss in a previous episode. Tim Ferriss charges between $80,000 and $150,000 per sponsor per read.
Does he?
But that's because he has the ability. What was they called? I think they were called Four Sigmatic, and they were a mushroom coffee company out of Sweden or something. They put their entire marketing budget and, frankly, their entire business on the line and said, "We're going to roll the dice. We're going to do a month's worth of sponsoring the Tim Ferriss podcast." It blew their brand up.
Did it?
They sold out of stock on the day that podcast episode went out. It changed their business and changed the direction of their business. But the Tim Ferriss, and the point I'm making there is that Tim Ferriss has the ability to create and explode brands with one post because he's got such a deep connection to his audience, because he's got 5 million people on a mailing list. He's got thousands, millions of people who listen to him, his podcast. His podcast, then he can drive, he did a book called Tools of Titans. They were the best lessons of podcast guests.
I love that book.
Good book. That
did
came
2 books.
Directly. He did. Oh, did he do another one?
Yeah.
Off the back of that. Oh, okay.
Something of Mentors. Tool of
Tribe
Titans
of Mentors.
and Tribe
That's
of
right.
Mentors.
Yes.
There you go.
Again, those came as a consequence of the podcast. So don't just think like you've got to get more and more and more in terms of numbers and revenue to be a success, because podcast success, and make sure, I guess, that you are measuring the metric that you want to, because sometimes you can judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. And ultimately...
Think about that. Think about that.
I can't do it.
You can't. And also, don't, because this is a danger, and I know how I have a fairly good idea how my brain works now and how I can become... develop a certain type of behavior towards things, and by that I mean I can become a little bit obsessed with numbers. So if you set yourself a goal, as you're kind of going down this route, if you set yourself a goal of I want to get 1 million downloads, what do you do after that? 2 million, 3 million,
Yeah.
4, and I've done that with trying to get PBs in my park run. Started off at like 30 odd minutes and got it down to like trying to get it below 20 minutes and got it to like 20 minutes 40 seconds, whatever. Never got it below that, and that could become quite obsessive. And I'm saying you could end up with the same challenge of wanting to get certain number of downloads, certain number of followers, certain number of subscribers. So just be really careful. And I think, again, back to our mutual friend Simon Squibb, if you can tie it into getting woo-woo again, tie it into purpose, tie it into community, and actually helping people achieve something like we hope we're doing here with Pod School. Hopefully, you listening, we are helping you start, grow, and monetize your podcast. And that will mean more than getting this podcast, which is not a goal, to number 1 in the UK, number 1 in the world, 1 million subscribers, 10 million.
This is actually a great example of it. We have gone into this. This is a niche of a niche of a niche. Yes, podcasting is super popular, but the information, the education around podcasting as a medium is not that popular. No. We know this is not going to be something that bothers the top charts, and we're not bothered about that. This is also a podcast that's never going to get tens of thousands of pounds worth of sponsorship revenue because the audience for it is just simply not big enough.
Yeah, there are lots of people interested in podcasting, but what's the percentage you want to start a podcast?
Exactly that. But equally, from our perspective, the metric isn't how big this show can be, it's how much impact it can have. You know, if this is the show
Impact theory.
that is the catalyst that creates the next impact theory, that creates the next Diary of a CEO, that creates the next high performance. And, you know, I've had someone who literally changed the direction of their life because they launched a podcast because they love doing it. And then they're like, oh, I should do this more. And then they had these amazing conversations. Like, I think I want to be a therapist, a counsellor, a coach. And now they've done a completely different direction. 360, no, that's the same direction, isn't it? 180, they've done 180, which is the other direction, from a business that they didn't really like in the entertainment space. And now they focus mainly on coaching, consulting, mentoring, counselling, and making their podcast. And they just live a life that they love.
Could you imagine, I can imagine, that one of you listening to this podcast actually goes out and creates the next Joe Rogan sale, the next Diary of a CEO, the next High Performance, the next...
One other big show?
Yes.
Come on. I've got not one either. Happy Place. Happy Place.
I was trying to think of, funnily enough, I was trying to bloody think of Happy Place. Yeah, and for your niche, whatever the equivalent of that is. Now, that would, and getting those emails and those direct messages of people who have been inspired to take that action and create that thing that has led to, this passion, this purpose, has enabled them to
have a happy life.
Yeah, absolutely, and enjoy what they do. Then our work here is done, my son.
Don't dream of getting a bigger audience. Focus on getting better. You don't necessarily need to focus on getting bigger. Focus on getting better. Those 1% incremental. I speak to people all the time. I want to grow my podcast to the next level. What your downloads looking at the moment, I don't know. But then focus on that.
Yeah.
Listen back to your shows. Are you asking great questions? Are you making great content? Look at your artwork. Is it decent? Look at your clips. Are they engaging? Look at if you're serious about taking your podcast to the next level, look at what you're already doing and be really honest with yourself. I've done this with building the brand a bunch of times. I was like, oh, actually, that episode was crap. That video we put out was shit. That thing did not work. But don't knock yourself for it. Look at it, assess it, and improve. Don't wish that you were bigger by default. Wish that you were getting better or work towards getting better.
Yeah.
Bloody hell, it's been like a motivate. I feel like I want to give us a round of applause. What an episode.
I'm exhausted now.
What an episode. From motivation and inspiration to podcast tactics, strategies, and how to link up an RSS feed. We've got it all for you here on how to start, grow, and monetize your podcast. If you want more information about subjects like this, if you want to deep dive on how to take your podcast to the next level, click the link in the show notes or the show description. You can join Pod School, the #1 community for podcasters in the entire world. I'm just going to keep saying it now because in the ether and the universe, because we've gone flipping woo-woo today, we will bring it into reality. But come and join us over there. It's completely free to join. There are webinars, there are training videos, there is blueprints, guides, cheat sheets, downloads. A bit of woo-woo, a lot of woo-woo, a bunch of really nice podcasters, loads of people that you can talk to. You can help you with your launch. You can ask us expert advice. We do Q&A, all kinds of stuff. Join us. It is free. Click the link in the show notes of the show description. Join us over on Pod School. But from me and from Mr. Chisnell, aka the Podpreneur, we'll see you on the next episode. Ta-da.
Bye.